Hello, my name's Tim Fisher, one of the authors of Search Press. I'm currently busy creating artwork for book number 4. Summer usually sees me attending the Patchings Art Festival, where I spend 4 days demonstrating my art and chatting to visitors. The perspective book from the Drawing Masterclass series has proved so popular, it's been revitalised as an edition entitled Drawing Perspective. The book is packed with hints, tips and advice to help you learn the concept of drawing different subjects convincingly. During this short film, I will introduce you to two-point perspective and also show you alternative simple ways to draw what you see. Okay, I've set up my drawing board to give you a quick insight into how you would set something up using two-point perspective. What I've basically done is I put 2 pins at either end of the board. These represent my vanishing points, and then this vertical stick here, this represents where the object could be drawn. One of the things you tend to find when you're working with perspective, it's very much dictated as to where your head is. So if we sat down, then the angle would change like so. If we stood up and looked down on something, you start to look at it from the top. So the angle tends to change a little bit as you sit or stand. Also, if we move around the object, that will also change its position. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to draw a few simple cubes just to show you how this works. So if I start with a cube that's about on our eye level, one of the things I like to do when drawing perspective is to make sure that the pins aren't too close to the object I'm drawing. You can pick more or less anywhere you want to put these vanishing points, but the further away you can get them from the object, the more convincing it'll look. So if I do one that's got it's slightly more turned to the camera, you get this effect. Try not to draw over my finger. So you get something that looks like that. If we have a cube that's quite high up in the air, as if you were looking at the top of a skyscraper, the angles tend to get quite sharp as they get higher up. And we can also see the base of the object there. As we get lower down and we look down on an object, we tend to get this sort of shape. And looking down on an object, we tend to see a lot more of the top. So that's basically some of the different positions you can draw objects, relating them to 2 vanishing points. So what I'm going to show you now is how you can relate this to drawing a building in the landscape. One of my chapters in the perspective book covers the subject of drawing boats. It's something people tend to find tricky to do. So what I've done in that chapter, I've covered all sorts of eventualities, lots of different positions on the beach and viewpoints. So what I'm going to show you now is just a very simple way of drawing a boat within a box. So if you have a look here on the board, I've drawn another rectangle using exactly the same method as I used earlier on when I was drawing the different cubes using the 2 vanishing points. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to draw a boat inside this box. I put a little bit of tracing paper over the top so it'll make it a little bit easier for you to see what I'm up to. So if I start by drawing a figure of 8, and try and keep that inside the box and join that up like so. The figure of 8 tends to cross where this near corner is of the box. So the next thing we need to do is put in the pointed end and then the back end of the boat like so, and then just join those up like that. If I bring that down there, put a little front piece on the boat and a little rail that runs around the top, and use a little bit of shading just to cover up that part of the boat there. And I'm just going to rub that other bit out so it just makes it a little bit clearer what's going on there. And on the back there, often you see this little notch in the back of the boat there. We could probably just see the seat, which will run across and around there, and another little bench that runs across on the boat there. So if I take that off now, off the square, you should be able to see the boat. So that's how you draw a boat in a box, and it's obeying the rules of perspective, because we've basically drawn the box as a perspective form, drawn the boat inside the box, so the boat has to follow those same rules, even though it's not necessarily obvious when you look at that sketch. I've just ventured out into the village looking for something suitable to sketch later on. I've found this building. This is Three Bears Cottage. It's a fairly new building, but it does show the perspective lines off particularly well. One of the problems you get if you try to do vanishing points is something as large as this. Your vanishing points are a long, long way away. So often it's easier to use this very simple tool. This is just two pieces of card connected together with a brass head. And I use this as an angle finder, so I can actually offer this up to the building and I can measure the angle of the gutter, and that actually makes it easier to do my measurement. I can also use it as a measuring stick to measure the width of the building and compare that with the front edge of the building. So that's a very handy tool to use, and it's something you can very easily make yourselves out of just a piece of mount card and a split pen. Right, back in the studio now after our trip out into the village to see Three Bears Cottage. What I've done, I've taken a photograph of the subject and I've pasted it onto this board just to show you how the perspective works in this situation. One of the first things you have to decide is where your horizon line is. This is the line that I've represented by this chain dotted line going all the way across. So this is really your eye level. This is, because I'm standing across the street, my head is roughly the same height as this chain dotted line. So if I draw a little figure into the picture, now that person is roughly to scale, so their head is level with this chain dotted. The chain dots effectively go through where their eyes are, so that's why this is often known as an eye line. It's often a horizontal line going all the way through the picture. Now, as you can see, the angle we've chosen, it brings one vanishing point quite close to the building and another vanishing point which is quite a long way away. In fact, it's so far away I've run out of room on my board. People often ask, where do you place the vanishing points? If you were drawing something from scratch, you could choose where to put your vanishing points, and often they're an uneven distance from the subject. So this one's quite close and this one's quite far away, and that'll give you quite a reasonable structure to produce. If it's an object that already exists, you can discover the vanishing points by getting a ruler and just drawing lines along all the different angles and seeing where they converge. And these all converge on the eye line this side. On this side, they all converge over to this vanishing point here. And when you look, nearly everything obeys the rules of perspective. So this wall at the front disappears to the line, and the chimney at the top disappears to the line. One of the things that often fools people is when they draw a porch, you have to remember that that ridge line on the top of the porch, that will actually go all the way across to that distant vanishing point. Now, if you're out sketching, it's not really very practical to take a ruler and a massive piece of paper to do a drawing. So what I'm going to show you now are one or two techniques that you can draw this without worrying about where the vanishing points are, or having a really large piece of paper or really long rulers. So we'll go on to that now. Okay, so I'm going to show an alternative way of drawing this house without worrying too much about vanishing points. If we go back a long way to the time of Pompeii, when they did a lot of archaeological research, they discovered frescoes which showed perspective really quite well, even though the Romans didn't really have a grasp of vanishing points. But one of the things they did was they realised that things had angles. So if they felt if they represented those angles correctly, then whatever they drew would look comparatively realistic. So that's what we're going to do now. We're just going to focus on measuring and angles to get this subject down onto paper. So I'm going to show you my sort of step-by-step procedure for doing that. So if we go back to Three Bears Cottage, I've put a figure in because sometimes if you pop a figure in, it helps you with scale. It helps you to just realise what's going on in the scene. So the first thing I will do is do a quick measurement. So I'm going to measure the height, and then I'm going to measure the width. And if you see there, the height of the building is almost the same as the end width. So that's an interesting piece of information to start with. This is basically just a cube, very similar to the cubes we drew earlier on, with another little cube attached to the back. So I'm basically going to do a few measurements to get this right. I always start with the corner that's closest to me. So I will start just by drawing a vertical line to represent that corner. Now I know with that measurement that the width is the same as the height. So if I measure the height of my line that I've marked and just do a mark there, I can then draw this edge in, and that gives me that back wall. What I can do then is measure the front of the building. Now, when you've got something that recedes into the landscape, it's always difficult to get this dimension right. Often we make this too long because we know that that is the longest wall of the house, full of doors and windows, so we often make it too long. So it's always worth measuring this. So if I measure that, it goes into that end just over 2 times. So we can do this in reverse. We can look at that width, and that looks just slightly less than halfway. So if I need to have a distance up from there to there approximately. So it's often a lot shorter than you think. Now, one of the tricks I use when I'm drawing is I will slope these angles outwards slightly because perspective, this isn't just 2-point perspective, there's actually a third perspective going off up into the air. We can ignore that to a certain extent, but it's always good to make your lines slope inwards, and then your buildings will always look upright. If you try and do a vertical line, it can often make the building lean to the left or the right, and you only usually discover this when you've finished your drawing and you try and put a mount on your artwork. So that's established 3 of the outer walls. What I need to do next is measure this angle on here. So I use one of these devices which I showed you earlier on, an angle finder, and this is very useful to place on the vertical wall and then just slope that down, and that gives me an idea of what angle that gutter is going. So if I draw that in there, that gets the first bit in. We also need to look at the angle that's created from that point to that point. So again, I'm going to put that on there, put that on, and that's a very, very shallow angle. So I'll do that as a much fainter line because that's not a line you can really see very well. If I do a little cross like so and then bring that line up, that's really the apex of the roof. And again, if I measure that width, that width is the same as the height of the apex. So if I do that, put a little dot there, I can actually join up the roof of the house. Then we've got this top line here, which is the ridge line. Now, one of the things I do is look at the shape of the roof. Often it's just a very slim parallelogram, so it looks almost like that. So if I draw that shape into here, that just about represents the shape that that roof's making. We then want the chimney, so if I put a vertical line up, that chimney sits either side of that vertical line. So if I put a chimney up there, and it wants a front on it as well. And again, the top of that chimney is trying to get down to the same vanishing points as all the other bits. So sometimes it's easy to just put the angle finder on and find that's really quite a steep angle. The angle that goes that way, we know it's going downhill. I can just guess at that and just bring that down like so, and then put a chimney pot on the top. So we're now starting to get a building that's looking like the one in the landscape. We now need to just put that little extension on the back. Now this is where your brain plays tricks on you. That ridge line there, often you can look at that and you think that's actually going uphill, whereas in reality that's going downhill to the vanishing point over there somewhere. So if I look at where that line intersects, it's just slightly more than halfway, and I know because I've got another vanishing point that's got to go downhill ever so slightly. So if we want to get a good idea of the angle, we can put that on. Then we would need to find the distance from there to there. So that is slightly longer than the front of the house. So if I put a mark there, again we want another vertical there, which is sloping outwards ever so slightly. I don't over exaggerate, there's just a slight tilt on that. And then this line here, again that's got to go downhill to there, something like that. I can now join the top and the bottom. And we've now got that shape. So it's starting to take shape now. Now the next thing we can do is start to add some of the other elements. The porch, which is roughly halfway. As I said earlier on, the ridge line there has got to go downhill to that vanishing point that sits over there somewhere. So as long as you're aware of the vanishing points, you don't necessarily have to draw them in. So we'll do a little bit like that. And that's the porch, and it wants a front door. Now another trick you can use is when you've got windows in a building, I generally tend to just hang them off the gutter line. So if I do two parallel lines like so, I never bother to put the sill on the bottom. That's a line you don't have to worry about when you're doing a drawing and obeying the rules of perspective. We've got another one in the middle there, which is, again is a couple of parallel lines. When we go to the ground floor windows, we can do exactly the same. We can just do two parallel lines, and that will represent the windows. Even if they're out of alignment and not obeying all these vanishing points, the brain still accepts what's going on with those. We've got a little window here, which is probably at the top of the stairs. That more or less hangs off that line that I drew across earlier on. So we can put a top on that, and we can now just start to add one or two extra bits to it. So we can put a little bit of dark in there. I'm going to make these little Georgian windows, so I'm actually drawing the negative shapes, the dark shapes that you can see in a window and a little bit of dark there. So it's starting to take shape now. I've not put any of the lines in on the base of the building. Again, these are lines you don't have to worry about too much. I think for the aesthetics of the subject, I'm going to leave those off and it'll sit in the landscape a little better. There is another building off to the side which sort of slopes down like so. Now, because this building is on the same level as the rest of the street, that angle has got to go downhill like that. And again, that edge there is often very narrow, and because we're looking at this at street level, I can't actually see the top of the roof, so I'm going to leave that as it is. The next thing to do is think about the light and the shading. So I'm going to bring the light in from this side. So this is an opportunity to put a nice drop shadow under the eaves of the roof, and we can throw that side of the chimney into shadow. This gable end is all going to go into shadow. I've got a really soft pencil here. This is a 6B pencil. Normally I work with a 3B, but for the purpose of this film I'm working with a 6B just so you can see what's going on. What we probably want to do now is just a little bit of artistic license, and we're going to put a tree in here, and we'll probably have another tree going around there. That often helps to just bookend the subject and make it just a little bit more painterly. You can make things up when you sketch, and often it can actually enhance and add to the subject. And we just need to throw the end of that barn into shadow as well as the porch. Now, what often happens with a porch is, because it's a canopy, that will actually cast a shadow down that side. Put the windows in the ground floor, and we probably just want a little bit of shade on there. It might be quite nice because the sun is coming down at an angle like that. It might be nice to have a little cast shadow on that roof like so. Sometimes you get shadows within shadows, so even here under the eaves there will be a little bit of darkness from the shadows. And there we have Three Bears Cottage. A nice simple way of drawing it without drawing vanishing points or anything like that. It's you'll find this is one of the chapters in the book which gives you a load of alternative techniques to draw what you see. This book's specifically designed to help people who like to go out sketching and drawing, and hopefully that'll give you a bit of a steer on what you can do when you're out drawing yourselves. Just time for a quick tea break. Now I'm going to show you some alternative ways of drawing Three Bears Cottage. One of the ways we can work is to think about negative shapes or abstract shapes. Now, if we look at this subject here, if we imagine that we take a pair of scissors and we cut out various parts of this, we'll end up with a whole bunch of abstract shapes, just like a jigsaw puzzle. If we then draw those shapes, it makes it easier to draw what we see. So we're actually drawing shapes and patterns rather than worrying about vanishing points and eye lines and things like that. So I'm going to show you my abstract drawing technique for drawing Three Bears Cottage. It's a subject where we have to be aware of the outside edge of the subject as well. This is known as the format of the subject. So if I start off just here, and I'm going to work around where that tree is and just draw all around the outside edge of the cottage. I might go a little bit quiet because sometimes you have to concentrate a little bit when you're drawing these things. Your knowledge of perspective doesn't have to be too great when you're doing this, though it is worth being aware of angles and where they go, otherwise you can get tripped up ever so slightly. But because we're drawing the abstract shape, it is a little bit easier to see. And now I'm going along the top edge of the image, drawing that down there. So I've drawn one quite large abstract shape here, which is mainly made up of the sky. But what it's actually done, it's actually got most of that building in as part of the drawing. So if I now draw the wall, I have to just judge roughly where that starts, and that comes in something like that. And then we have another one which goes in there, and that's the for sale sign, which incidentally still obeys perspective. That top edge is going downhill to a vanishing point over there somewhere. And there's the figure. There's a little red car parked there, so I'm going to go around the edge of that and then hit the fence, go along the fence, back, down and along the bottom. So now I've started drawing two quite large abstract shapes. It's given me most of the shape of the cottage. What I can do now is start to draw in the rest of the cottage without worrying about any shapes and patterns. So if I draw that little parallelogram again in for the roof, I'll shade it in so you can see it. We've got that little bit going in there. That's actually, that edge there, that's part of that barn. So we'll bring that down like so. Doesn't matter if you don't get it exactly right. Often if you get it approximately right, it can still look quite convincing as a sketch. Again, just hanging those windows off the gutter because I've got that angle right, so I don't have to worry about the angles of my windows, and the ridge line of the porch. And that is basically how I would lay something out and get started when using negative shapes or abstract shapes. You can do a little correction if you've not quite got something right, but that is a pretty reasonable representation of Three Bears Cottage. In fact, it's so popular it's even for sale. Just one more technique I'm going to show you, which is something I use a lot. This is speed scribble. This is something that you would use when you get a reasonable understanding of perspective, because although I'm not worrying about vanishing points and eye lines, I am still aware of the angles of the building. I work very, very quickly when I do this, and it helps to capture the information of the subject down, you know, when you're standing up or you're under time pressure. So this is how I go about it. I'm using a fine fibre tip pen. This is a Pitt artist pen. I find these work extremely well. Normally I would start probably with a chimney, and then I work very, very quickly. Often the lines are quite scribbly, but you get a lovely painterly feel. I'm still aware of the format of the subject. But using this technique, you can get information down very, very quickly. It's very, very useful if you want to get a subject down, some sort of fleeting subject down very quickly. So normally, once I've completed that part, I would then add tone to it, usually with a graphite pencil, and this helps to just bulk the subject out, and you can make slight corrections with the graphite if you find there's some part of it you've not drawn too well. Often it's nice to have a shadow that runs across the lower foreground. This is usually, you can let the shadow sort of run up the side of the wall, and I always feel that's quite a nice effect. There we go. To give you an example of how I put this into practice, this is a subject I did of St Mark's Square in Venice, where I used a matchstick dipped in ink, working very, very quickly to produce the subject, and then I worked over it in watercolour. I did this as a demonstration for an art group, and I think it probably took me about an hour and a half to do. Well, I hope you enjoyed those little demonstrations. Hopefully it's given you a bit of an insight into drawing what you see without becoming too bogged down in perspective. What I've tried to do in this book is cover as many different aspects of that subject as I can without getting too technical, without doing too many technical things. So hopefully when you buy the book, you'll see there's lots of useful techniques in there, besides just using a ruler and drawing lines, which helps you to draw what you see in the landscape.